The following is a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.
Meet Professor Roger Hill, historian, adventurer, and raconteur extraordinaire. He travels to parallel worlds where history went differently and brings back lectures on his findings. So grab a prime seat, pay attention, and take good notes. This is Alternate History 100. Welcome to the class.
Good morning. We've already done a seminar on the world where John F. Kennedy survived the assassination attempt and went on to serve 2 full terms of office. Today, I want to flip that burger and cook the other side. What if he were never elected president at all? I found 3 worlds where that happened. In one, he died in 1943 when PT-109 went down in the Pacific. In another, he lost the 1960 election to Richard Nixon. But I think the one we're going to do today is the most interesting of the 3. Just a few months ago, we came through an election. And like every election you've ever seen, it was preceded by a long run of primaries. A run that seems to get longer with each cycle. I mean, people are already talking about who's going to run in 2028. And yeah, I get that. The world kind of feels like it needs a fast-forward button right now. But the thing is, this was not always the case. Primaries have been around since 1903, but prior to 1960, they had never taken a man to the White House. And even at that date, only 16 states had them, and some of those were not binding at the National Convention. So the parties didn't come in to coronate someone who had already won. No, their conventions were knockdown, drag-out fights filled with drama and conflict. In 1924, the Democratic Convention lasted 15 days and took 103 ballots. It was kind of like Survivor with bow ties and bootleg gin. That all changed in 1960. Who do you suppose made that happen?
Kennedy.
Yes, John F. Kennedy. It's hard to imagine, but he had at the time a whole bunch of strikes against him. He was not in the inner circle of Washington. He was a Catholic, and believe me, that mattered to a lot of people back then. And he was only 43 years old. Which may seem ancient to you, but many thought him trying to be president was like seeing the brainy kid who skipped 3 grades asking the prom queen to dance. Sorry, kid, you're just not ready. Kennedy knew he wouldn't be given the nomination by the party bosses at the convention in Los Angeles. He knew he had to prove himself. And so he stepped into the primary process that the top contenders avoided. His only real opponent in this was Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey was a capable opponent who in our world went on to serve as vice president under Lyndon Johnson. But Kennedy beat him in Wisconsin, which was right next to Humphrey's home state of Minnesota, and beat him again in West Virginia, a rural Protestant state that nobody thought would support a Catholic. And by these wins, he proved to the party bosses that he could actually win the big prize, even if some of them had socks that were older than he was. Staying out of the primaries were the 3 big contenders, Lyndon Johnson, Adlai Stevenson, and Stuart Symington. They all saw themselves winning the nomination in the traditional way. But that's our world. In the other world, Johnson went against the advice of those who told him that he had little to win and everything to lose by entering the primaries. He stumbled in Wisconsin, where Kennedy managed to beat him by a couple of cow whiskers. But he came back big in West Virginia, which was more amenable to a Southerner from Texas than a Catholic Yankee, make that damn Yankee, from Massachusetts. In our world, that primary was the acid test for Kennedy. And it was over there, too. His defeat suggested that Protestant America, and particularly the South, which was solidly Democratic at the time, would not support him in sufficient numbers to get him the win. He was urged to drop out and fight another day. But he stubbornly hung in for a while, at least until Hubert Humphrey dropped out and threw his support behind Johnson. That ended Kennedy's hopes, so he threw in the towel and went back to his Senate seat to lick his wounds. When the convention came, the party went with what they saw as the safest choice. Despite support from Eleanor Roosevelt, they weren't going to give two-time loser Adlai Stevenson another turn at bat. Lyndon Johnson got the nomination for president and made Humphrey his running mate. He went on to defeat Richard Nixon in the general election and was sworn in as America's 35th president on January 20th, 1961. Now in our world, 1961 was pretty eventful. We can start off with the founding of the Peace Corps, a wonderful organization that has done much to spread goodwill around the world for the past 6 decades. You might want to consider it yourself, but since it was President Kennedy's baby, it simply didn't happen over there. And then there was the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was a plan that Kennedy inherited from the Eisenhower administration, and he let it go forward based on CIA intel that the Cuban people would rise up to support the invaders. And of course, that didn't happen. In our world, Kennedy took the heat for that and made a mea culpa to the press that actually lifted him in the polls. But in the other world, it was Johnson who was fed the false information. And he made exactly the same mistake that Kennedy did in our world. But there was a key difference. Kennedy had charm. He could talk his way out of the hot water he had landed in. Johnson did not have that gift and took a shellacking in the polls. In the summer of 1961, the Berlin Wall went up. Kennedy railed against it, and 2 years later went there, where he made his famous speech, Ich bin ein Berliner. Thank you. And apologies for my mangled German. Over there, it was Johnson. Poor Johnson. He couldn't make a speech like that. Oh, he said something, but nobody remembers it like we remember Kennedy. And then there was the space race speech at Rice University in 1962. Here it comes. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Thank you. You gotta realize that when Kennedy made that speech, they could barely put a man in orbit. The goal was huge. It was audacious. But Kennedy made people believe it, and that helped make it happen. Johnson had all the same people at his disposal, but he couldn't sing that song if you put the lyric sheet right in his hands. So Johnson's America did get to the moon, but it didn't happen before the decade, that's how he said it, was over. Civil rights. In our world, Kennedy carried that football up the field and Johnson got it over the goal line. In that world, it was all Johnson. And once again, it all happened a little bit later. Does later make a difference? Refer back to your notes from the James Watt seminar on that one. Later civil rights did make a difference in that world, particularly to people at the bottom of the pile. And the most obvious result was that the riots in the cities of that world were much worse than they were in ours. The Cuban Missile Crisis. For many, this was the whetstone on which Kennedy's greatness was sharpened. The Russians had put missiles in Cuba just 90 miles from Florida. They would have been able to target any city in the East, Washington, New York, Boston, with almost no warning. But Kennedy put a naval blockade on the island, turned back the Russian ships, and got Nikita Khrushchev to back down. It was the greatest accomplishment of his brief time in office. But that's our world. Over there, it was Johnson in the big chair, and he took the same actions that Kennedy took and achieved the same results. But once more, he was unable to sell it to the public. In our history, Kennedy was seen as a man who had saved the world. Over there, Johnson was seen as someone who had almost started a nuclear holocaust. We've already discussed what the Kennedy assassination meant in our world. But in that world, no one assassinated Johnson. It didn't take the sharp turn that we took, and there was no rise of conspiracy theories like we had. The great economy of the time helped Johnson get reelected in 1964, and his chances weren't hurt when the Republicans chose Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater as their candidate. The Democrats successfully cast him as a lunatic who would start World War III, and they went on to win in a landslide. From there, Johnson did all the same things he did here, with the exception of dropping out of the 1968 race because he wasn't eligible to run again. But once more, things came out pretty much as they did in our world. There was a melee for the Democratic nomination, but over there it wasn't Bobby Kennedy who was creating the stir. It was John F. Kennedy trying to do the thing he failed to do in 1960. And it was he who was assassinated in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel right after winning the California primaries. By whom? Well, just like here. Sirhan, a Palestinian disgruntled by America's support for Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967. And just like here, Sirhan was immediately tackled to the ground by Rafer Johnson. There was no doubt of his guilt and no conspiracy theories floating out of it. Vice President Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic nomination at a violence-plagued convention in Chicago and went on to lose the general election to Richard Nixon, just like here. So what's the difference? Well, that world didn't have a Camelot. It didn't have the handsome young president with the beautiful wife and adorable children. The president who could lift words off the page and make them soar. The president who could inspire people to find their better angels, to have hope, to believe that we could put a man on the moon and have justice at home. Thank you. Maybe I should incorporate more of his style into my lectures. Without him, America just had a workmanlike president who got a lot done, but couldn't get anyone excited about it. Kennedy's defeat in the 1960 primaries delayed the advancement of the primary process, but his success in 1968 pretty much put it back on track. Many over there believe he would have snagged the nomination had he not been killed. Your assignment is to compare and contrast the zeitgeist of the 1960s in the two worlds. How much was this affected by the presence and absence of the Kennedy administration? Does this support the notion of the great man theory? I'll make this a short one. 1,000 words, editorial style, due next time we meet. Class dismissed. Hi, I'm Gary Wheeler. Alternate History 100 is a labor of love with the twin goals of entertaining you and making you think. If you like what you heard today, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and tell your friends about us. Your word of mouth can really help this channel grow. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, keep thinking and make some history of your own.
The preceding was a work of fiction and should not be taken as actual history.